fiancée I thought I'd spend forever with, and a family business that I poured my blood, sweat, and years into. But none of it mattered. Not when my brother, Dylan, the golden child, the screw-up who had failed at everything in life, decided he wanted what was mine. Not when my father, the man I spent my entire life trying to prove myself to, handed it all to him on a silver platter like I had never existed. They thought they could break me, take everything I'd built, and leave me with nothing. But they didn't realize I was the storm they never saw coming. And before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. I had it all: a career I built from the ground up, a fiancé I thought I'd spend forever with, and a family business that I poured my blood, sweat, and years into. But none of it mattered. Not when my brother, Dylan, the golden child, the screw-up who had failed at everything in life, decided he wanted what was mine. Not when my father, the man I spent my entire life trying to prove myself to, handed it all to him on a silver platter like I had never existed. They thought they could break me, take everything I built, and leave me with nothing. But they didn't realize I was the storm they never saw coming. My name is Ryan. I'm 32 years old, an electrician by trade, and a man who learned the hard way that loyalty is a dangerous thing when given to the wrong people. My brother Dylan is 29, entitled, reckless, and the kind of man who could set his life on fire and still expect someone else to put it out for him. He was always the favorite, the baby, the one my parents protected, no matter how badly he failed. My father, a hard, controlling man in his 60s, spent his entire life pretending he was fair while making it clear who mattered more. Dylan could do no wrong in his eyes. I, on the other hand, had to prove myself every single day. My mother? She tried to keep the peace, but she was never strong enough to stand up to my father, never strong enough to choose what was right over what was easy. And then there was Madison, smart, driven, beautiful, everything I thought I wanted in a partner. I believed she had my back, that she was in this with me. I was wrong. For years, I worked side by side with my father in the family's electrical business, building it up, modernizing it, bringing in bigger contracts. I sacrificed my time, my energy, my sanity, because I thought it was all leading to something, a future where I could finally step out of my father's shadow and run the business the way I knew it could be. Madison was right there with me, handling operations, keeping things running smoothly, making me believe we were building something together. We were engaged, planning our wedding, talking about buying a house, dreaming of the life we would have, but behind my back something else was happening, something that would tear my entire world apart. The signs were there, but I ignored them. The late nights at the office, the quiet conversations, the way Madison started defending Dylan when I complained about his laziness. I brushed it off, convinced myself it was nothing, because I trusted her. Because I never believed that my own brother, the guy who had watched me build my life from scratch, would be capable of stabbing me in the back in the worst way imaginable. But I was wrong. So wrong. By the time I saw the truth, it was too late. Madison was pregnant, and she didn't even know if the baby was mine or Dylan's. My father didn't just forgive them. He rewarded them. He handed Dylan the family business, the house I had been saving for, and told me to train my brother to take my place. They thought I would just roll over and accept it, that I would let them win. They didn't understand that they had just started a war. Dylan had been the golden child from the moment he was born. It didn't matter what he did or how badly he screwed up, there was always an excuse, always a reason why it wasn't really his fault. He was the baby of the family, the one who needed protecting, the one who got away with everything. If he failed a test, it was because the teacher didn't explain things well enough. If he skipped school, it was because he was too stressed and needed a break. If he wrecked his first car, it was just a mistake, one my father eagerly paid to fix without so much as a lecture. Meanwhile, I had to be perfect. I had to earn everything. If I so much as left a dish in the sink, I was lazy. If I missed a homework assignment, I wasn't working hard enough. I had to be twice as good just to be considered half as worthy, and no matter how much I did, it was never enough. The truth that no one ever said out loud, but I could feel in every interaction, was that part of it came down to race. Dylan took after our mother. Lighter skin, softer features, the one people assumed was safe. I looked like my father. Black, strong-jawed, the one who had to prove he wasn't a threat before people gave him a chance. My father, a man who had spent his whole life trying to fit in with the world that never fully accepted him, had made sure Dylan never had to fight that battle. He didn't even realize he was doing it, but I did. I saw it in the way he looked at Dylan with pride, the way he made excuses for him, the way he acted like the world was supposed to work for him instead of against him, and I saw it in the way he looked at me, with expectation, with scrutiny, always waiting for me to mess up, so he could remind me that life would be harder for me, that I would have to work for what Dylan was given without effort. From the time I was old enough to understand how things worked in our house, I knew that I was the one expected to be responsible. If something broke, I had to fix it. If Dylan got in trouble, I had to be the one to smooth things over. My father would look at me like I was supposed to be his second in command, the one who would handle things when Dylan inevitably screwed up, but never with the same warmth he gave my brother. He'd say things like, "You need to be the man of the house when I'm not around," while Dylan got to be the one having fun, making mistakes, being forgiven. The resentment built slowly, a quiet storm inside me that I forced myself to ignore, because what else was I supposed to do? This was my family. This was my life. And no matter how much it ate at me, I still wanted my father's approval, still wanted to believe that one day he'd finally see me the way I had always wanted to be seen. My father built his electrical business from the ground up, and he ran it like it was still the 1980s pen and paper invoices, word-of-mouth marketing, no website, no real system beyond what he had been doing for decades. He had skill, there was no doubt about that, but he refused to adapt, refused to see that the world was changing around him. When I turned 16, I started working with him, not because I wanted to, but because I knew it was the only way to earn his respect. I learned everything I could, watching, practicing, picking up jobs that should have been his responsibility. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was the one keeping the business afloat, bringing in new clients, negotiating better contracts, and finding ways to expand beyond just residential work into commercial projects. But no matter how much I did, my father still treated it like his business, like I was just another worker rather than the person keeping it running. Dylan, of course, was never expected to lift a finger. He drifted from one failed business idea to the next, chasing the latest get-rich-quick scheme. He tried selling electronics online, failed, started a car detailing business, lasted 6 months, got into cryptocurrency, lost everything. Every time he crashed and burned, my father was there to pick him up, tell him he was just figuring things out, and remind me that Dylan had a good head for business and just needed the right opportunity. Meanwhile, I had spent years proving myself, and somehow it was never enough. Then came Madison. I met her on a job at a high-end apartment complex downtown, one of the biggest projects we had ever taken on. She was the property manager, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she wasn't like the others I had worked with before. She wasn't just another person in a suit who had no idea what they were talking about. She understood the work, the codes, the technical aspects. She wasn't afraid to call out mistakes or push for things to be done the right way. She challenged me, and I respected that. It started with work, but it grew into something more. We talked about everything, our ambitions, our families, the expectations we had been forced to live under. She got it. She understood what it was like to have to fight twice as hard for recognition, to have people assume you weren't good enough before you even had a chance to prove yourself. She was the first person who really saw me, and for the first time, I thought maybe I had found someone who would stand by my side no matter what. We moved in together after 2 years, and by year 4, I proposed. She said yes, and for a while it felt like my life was finally falling into place. I had a plan, a future, something solid to hold on to. I just didn't see the cracks forming underneath it all. Dylan came back home the same way he always did, broke, desperate, and full of excuses. His latest business idea, something about flipping cars for high-end clients, had crumbled just like all the others. He had lost everything, and instead of taking responsibility, he showed up at my parents' house like he always did, looking for a bailout. And just like always, my father gave it to him. Without hesitation, without question, he handed Dylan a job at our business, putting him on the payroll even though Dylan had never lifted a damn finger in his life to help build it. I told my father it was a mistake. I told him Dylan would mess everything up just like he always did, that he wasn't built for real work. But my father dismissed me, said Dylan just needed direction, that with the right guidance he could learn the trade, and guess who he expected to be the one to train him? I was too busy running actual jobs to babysit my brother, so that responsibility somehow fell onto Madison. It made sense on paper. She was already handling the business side, and since Dylan was supposed to be learning office operations, they had to spend time together. At first, I didn't think much of it. Madison had always been good at fixing problems, keeping things organized, making sure nothing fell through the cracks. But then I started noticing little things, small shifts that didn't sit right. She started staying later at the office, saying she needed extra time to help Dylan catch up. She started talking about him differently, in a way that made me feel like I was the one being too hard on him. "He's trying," she would say whenever I complained about how useless he was. "You should give him a chance." The first time I really felt something was off, I walked into the office late at night after a job. I had forgotten my tablet and I figured Madison had already gone home, but when I stepped inside, I heard laughter, hers and Dylan's. I followed the sound to the break room where they were sitting too close, talking in hushed voices. Dylan had this smirk on his face, the kind he always had when he knew he was getting away with something, and when Madison saw me, she jolted like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. It was a split second, just a flicker of something in her expression, before she forced a casual smile and said they were just going over scheduling. But Dylan? He just leaned back in his chair, grinning like this was all some big joke. I stood there, feeling something in my gut that I couldn't quite put into words, something dark and heavy. I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my tablet and walked out. But I should have asked the questions that were screaming in the back of my mind. I should have seen it for what it was. Because that wasn't the first time they had been alone together late at night, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. It started small, the kind of changes that are easy to ignore when you trust someone. Madison had never been the type to hide things from me. We knew each other's passwords, not because we checked each other's phones, but because we never had a reason to be secretive. But one night, I reached for her phone to check something, just like I had 100 times before, and she yanked it away so fast it was like I had caught her holding a lit match over gasoline. She forced a laugh, said something about her banking app making her update security settings, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. That was the first time I felt it. Something was wrong. Then she stopped talking about the wedding. Before, she had been excited, sending me links to venues, debating colors, bringing up honeymoon destinations while we ate dinner. But suddenly, every time I mentioned it, she was too stressed to think about it. "Work has been crazy," she'd say. "There's so much going on with the business." The business. That was the excuse for everything now. The extra hours, the late nights, the exhaustion in her voice, and Dylan somehow was always part of it. The thing that really set me off was how she started defending him. Madison had never been one to sugarcoat things. If someone was slacking, she called them out. She was the one who used to tell me Dylan was a walking disaster, that he was never going to get his life together. But now, if I so much as pointed out that he had screwed up a simple task, she'd roll her eyes and tell me I was being unfair. "He's trying," she'd say, irritation creeping into her voice like I was the problem. "You expect him to be perfect overnight?" It didn't matter what he did, showing up late, messing up orders, giving customers the wrong information. She always had a reason why it wasn't his fault. I was the one who needed to be more patient. I was the one who needed to stop holding the past against him. I wanted to believe she was just trying to keep the peace, that maybe she really thought she was helping, but deep down I knew better. Something was shifting, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and every time I looked at Dylan, that smug grin of his made me want to break something, because he knew. Even if I couldn't see it yet, he already knew how this was going to end. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, a day like any other. I was on a job knee-deep in rewiring a commercial building when my phone started buzzing non-stop. Madison, over and over. Something in my gut twisted, that same heavy feeling I'd been carrying for weeks. I answered, and all I could hear was her breathing, shaky, uneven. Then she said it. "Ryan, I need to see you. It's serious." I dropped everything, told my crew I had an emergency, and drove straight home. She was already there, sitting in her car in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her together. When I pulled up, she didn't look at me. She just stared ahead, eyes red-rimmed, face pale. I got in on the passenger's side, my pulse hammering in my ears. "What's going on?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She sucked in a breath, and then, barely above a whisper, she said it. "I'm pregnant." For a second, I felt nothing but pure happiness. We had talked about kids, about starting a family, and even though the timing wasn't perfect, it was still ours, still something we had built together. I started saying exactly that, telling her we'd figure it out, that maybe we could move up the wedding. But then she closed her eyes, shaking her head. "There's more," she choked out. It might not be yours." It felt like my entire body had been ripped open. The world outside that car, the sounds of the street, the wind through the trees, everything just faded to static. I turned slowly, staring at her, waiting for her to take it back, waiting for her to say she misspoke. But she didn't. The words came out, cold and sharp. Who else? She opened her mouth, but I already knew. The second the question left my lips, I knew. Tell me it's not Dylan. Her breath hitched. She didn't answer. That silence was louder than any confession. I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just something broken, something raw. You've got to be kidding me. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said quickly, desperate now. It was a mistake. We ended it weeks ago, I swear. My hands curled into fists on my lap. How long? She flinched. 3 months, she whispered. Then quieter. Maybe 4. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to keep my hands steady. Does he know? She nodded. I told him yesterday. I exhaled sharply. That was it. That was the moment I realized everything I had built, everything I had believed in, had been a lie. I got out of the car, needing air, needing distance. She scrambled after me, talking too fast, saying things I couldn't even process. How it didn't mean anything, how she felt guilty, how they had never meant to hurt me. But all I could think about were the late nights, the laughter I had walked in on, the way she had started defending him. Were you ever going to tell me if you hadn't gotten pregnant? I asked, my voice cold, detached. She didn't answer. That silence told me everything. I left her standing there and drove straight to my parents' house. I stormed into the office and there he was, Dylan, feet kicked up on the desk, acting like he owned the place. The second he saw my face, he knew. Listen, bro, I can explain. I didn't let him finish. My fist connected with his face before he could even stand. He crashed to the floor, blood gushing from his nose. Then he looked up at me, grinning through the pain. We're in love, bro. I didn't even feel myself move. 1 second, Dylan was sitting there with that smug, infuriating grin, and the next, I had my hands on him, driving him backward with everything I had. He hit the desk hard, the cheap wood cracking under the force, sending papers and office supplies flying. He barely had time to react before I grabbed him by the collar and slammed my fist into his face again. The sound of impact, the satisfying crunch of bone against bone, should have made me feel something, relief, satisfaction, anything. But all I felt was pure, unfiltered rage. He tried to shove me off, scrambling like the coward he was, but I wasn't letting go, not after what he had done. I drove my knee into his ribs, making him gasp in pain before hauling him up just to slam him down again. You're in love? I spat, gripping his shirt so tight my knuckles went white. You're in love with my fiancée, the woman I was supposed to marry. Dylan coughed, blood dripping from his nose, but still, he had that goddamn smirk on his face. Guess she wanted a real man after all, he muttered, his voice laced with arrogance. I lost it. Everything inside me snapped. I pulled back my fist to end it, to break something that wouldn't heal, when suddenly, strong arms wrapped around me, yanking me backward. Enough! My father's voice thundered through the room as he dragged me off Dylan, shoving me away like I was the problem. Dylan groaned, rolling onto his side, wiping at the blood dripping onto his shirt. My chest heaved, my vision tunneling as I turned on my father. You're defending him? After what he did? After what she did? My father's face was red, his hands shaking with rage, not at Dylan but at me. This is why I never trusted you, he snarled, his voice laced with something darker than anger, something I had never wanted to admit was there. This is why I always put Dylan first. You're too angry, you're too aggressive, too much like your people. Everything inside me turned to ice. There it was, the truth that had been hanging over my head my entire life, unspoken but always there. It had never just been about Dylan being the golden child. It had never just been about favoritism. It had been about me, about who I was, about the parts of me my father had spent his entire life trying to suppress. I took a step back, feeling like I had been sucker punched. He had never seen me as his son, not really. He had seen me as a problem to control, something to mold into the version of himself that he wanted the world to accept. And now, standing there, breathing hard, my fist still aching from the impact of Dylan's face, I saw it clearly for the first time. I would never be enough for him. No matter what I did, no matter how much I built, no matter how much I sacrificed, I would always be the one he kept at arm's length, the one he looked at with scrutiny instead of pride. And Dylan, weak, pathetic Dylan, would always be the one he chose. I wiped the blood from my knuckles on my shirt, looked my father dead in the eye, and let out a bitter laugh. "You're right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm nothing like you, and thank God for that." Then I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what I was leaving behind. I should have known it wasn't over. People like my father don't let things go. They don't admit when they're wrong. They don't apologize. Instead, they double down, and that's exactly what he did. 2 days after I put Dylan on the floor, after I walked out of that house, thinking I was finally done with all of them, my mother called, her voice shaking. "Ryan, you need to come over. Your father wants to talk." I almost laughed. There was nothing left to say. But something in her tone, something desperate, made me drive back anyway. Not for him, not for Dylan, but because my mother had never once in my life begged me for anything. When I got there, they were all sitting in the living room like it was some kind of intervention. My father, stone-faced in his recliner, my mother, red-eyed and wringing her hands, and Dylan, sitting there with his arms crossed like he was the victim in all of this, like I had somehow wronged him. Madison wasn't there, but I didn't need to see her to feel the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. My father cleared his throat and went straight into one of his speeches, the kind I had heard my entire life, the kind where he pretended to be wise while he justified whatever bullshit decision he had already made. "Son, I've been thinking about how to resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone." I just stared at him, waiting for the punchline. "Since you're clearly not willing to work things out with Madison," he continued, "and given her condition, I think it makes sense for her and Dylan to get married." I felt something inside me snap, but I forced myself to stay silent. "And furthermore," he went on, like this was some kind of business deal instead of my life falling apart, "since they'll be starting a family, I believe it's appropriate for Dylan to take over the company. He's been learning a lot under Madison's guidance, and with his leadership skills, I believe he's the right person to carry on the family business." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "You're giving him the company?" My voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. My father nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. With Madison's experience running the office and Dylan learning the trade, they'll make a great team. Then he hit me with the final blow. "I want you to train him." I blinked, sure I had misheard. "You want me to make sure the transition is smooth," my father cut in. "You've always been the hardest worker, Ryan, but leadership, that's not your strength. You're too emotional. Dylan, on the other hand, has the natural charisma to run things. With you showing him the ropes, I think—" I laughed. I couldn't help it. A full, hollow laugh that made my mother flinch. Then I stood up, looked my father dead in the eye and said, "I hope you enjoy watching him burn it to the ground." And then I walked out. For good this time. I didn't look back. Not when my mother called my name, not when my father told me I was being childish, not when Dylan sat there smirking like he had won. I walked out of that house, out of that business, out of a life I had spent years trying to build, and I didn't stop. I drove straight to my apartment, packed a bag, and crashed at my buddy Nate's place for a few days while I figured out what the hell to do next. At first, it felt like I was floating, like my entire sense of direction had been ripped away. My whole life, everything I had worked for had revolved around that business. It wasn't just a job, it was a legacy, one I had poured my sweat into, one I had been waiting my whole damn life to take over. And in one conversation, it was gone. Stolen. Handed to the one person who deserved it the least. But the thing that really messed with my head, it wasn't losing the business. It wasn't even losing Madison. It was the fact that they were acting like this was normal, like this was just another chapter in some kind of twisted love story. Less than a month after I walked away, Madison and Dylan got married at the courthouse. No big wedding, no celebration, just paperwork and a few pictures they posted online like this was meant to happen all along. The captions made me sick. "Sometimes love finds you in unexpected places, a new beginning, forever my soulmate." I stared at those words, trying to understand how the woman I was supposed to marry, the woman who had spent years building a future with me, could so easily rewrite history like I never existed. People in the comments were congratulating them, buying into the lie. I saw family members, our family, posting hearts, saying things like, "So happy for you both." Like it wasn't betrayal of the highest order. I wanted to burn it all down. I wanted to show up, wreck their perfect little narrative, make them face what they had done. But then I realized something. They weren't happy. Dylan had everything he wanted: Madison, the business, my father's approval, but he was still the same screw-up he had always been. No amount of stolen victories would change that. And Madison? She had made her choice. She had picked the easy road, the one where she didn't have to fight for anything, the one where she got to keep my mother's sympathy and my father's protection. But deep down, she knew. She knew exactly what she had given up. So I let them have it, let them live in their perfect little delusion, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that karma was patient, and sooner or later, it was coming for them. It didn't take long for everything to start falling apart. Dylan might have been given the business, but he had no idea how to run it. He barely understood the basics of electrical work, let alone the responsibility that came with handling commercial contracts. At first, he kept up appearances, showing up to job sites and talking big about modernizing the company and taking things to the next level. But the second real problem started, his inexperience showed. He cut corners, ignored safety codes, and instead of listening to the guys who actually knew what they were doing, he acted like he was the smartest person in the room. The biggest mistake he made was hiring his old drinking buddy, some guy named Travis, as a lead electrician. The guy had no qualifications, no certifications, just a history of working odd jobs and changing light bulbs. But Dylan put him in charge anyway, probably because Travis told him what he wanted to hear. Together, they started taking on jobs they had no business handling. Complex rewiring projects, high-end commercial renovations, things that required real expertise. And instead of using licensed workers, Dylan started taking cash under the table, hiring guys off Craigslist who were willing to work for cheap. It was a disaster waiting to happen. At first, the problems were small. Clients complained about flickering lights, power surges, outlets that weren't wired correctly. But then bigger issues started rolling in. Entire electrical systems failing, circuits overloading, fire hazards being flagged by inspectors. Clients started demanding refunds. Some even threatened lawsuits. My father, too proud to admit he had made a mistake, kept making excuses. Kept telling people that Dylan just needed time. But time wasn't what Dylan needed. He needed experience, and he didn't have it. Then came the fire. It was a commercial job, a big contract Dylan had landed with a local business park that was renovating several office buildings. If I had still been in charge, I would have made sure every wire was up to code, every panel installed correctly. But I wasn't there. Dylan and his buddy Travis handled it, and they screwed it up in the worst way possible. A week after the final inspection, one of the buildings went up in flames. Faulty wiring in the breaker panel overheated, sparking a fire that spread through the insulation. It happened in the middle of the night, so no one was inside, but by the time the fire department put it out, the entire second floor was destroyed. The investigation didn't take long. Inspectors found exposed wires, missing grounding, improper fuses, things so blatantly wrong that it was clear whoever had done the job had no idea what they were doing. The owners sued immediately. But that was just the beginning. The insurance company did their own digging and discovered that Dylan had let their liability policy lapse months ago. He had been too busy pocketing money, trying to look successful, buying expensive suits and taking Madison to nice restaurants, that he hadn't even bothered to pay for the one thing that could have saved the company. Now, not only were they being sued for damages, but they were personally liable for every dollar. The business wasn't just in trouble, it was dead. The downfall happened fast. After the fire, everything unraveled. Clients pulled their contracts, banks froze their accounts, and the lawsuits piled up faster than my father could make excuses. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Vendors who hadn't been paid, employees whose checks were bouncing, subcontractors threatening to sue for unpaid work. The business was hemorrhaging money, and Dylan, who had spent his entire life skating by on charm and luck, had no idea how to stop it. Madison, always one to sense when a ship was sinking, started pulling away. At first, she tried to keep up the facade, standing by Dylan like they were some unstoppable team, but reality hit her quick. The house my father had helped them buy, under foreclosure. The lifestyle Dylan had promised her, vanishing overnight. The same man she had chosen over me, the one she had thrown away our future for, was finally showing his true colors. Not as some ambitious leader, but as the failure he had always been. Then, one day, she was just gone. She packed up her things, took the baby, and left. No dramatic goodbye, no last-minute plea for Dylan to change, just a short note on the kitchen counter. "Don't contact me, we're done." Dylan lost his mind. He raged, he blamed everyone but himself. He told anyone who would listen that Madison had betrayed him, that she had used him. Like the irony of that wasn't suffocating. But rage didn't pay the bills, and reality was closing in. The courts were coming after him for damages, the bank was coming for the house, and worst of all, my father, his biggest protector, was finally out of ways to save him. That's when Dylan did what he had always done when life got too hard. He ran. A week after Madison left, my father called me, his voice hollow, different than I had ever heard it before. "Dylan's gone," he said. "Cleaned out the last of our savings and disappeared." I sat there, holding the phone, waiting for some kind of reaction to hit me, some sense of satisfaction, of victory. But there was nothing. Dylan had been handed everything. He had been given every opportunity, every second chance, every advantage in life. And still, he had destroyed himself. "I don't know what to do," my father admitted, his voice barely a whisper. For the first time in my life, he sounded small, weak, beaten. And all I could say was, "Not my problem." Then I hung up. I knew it was only a matter of time before my father came crawling. He had spent his whole life believing he was the smartest man in the room, that no matter what happened, he could fix it, control it, bend it to his will. But this time, there was no fixing it. Dylan was gone. The business was in ruins. The lawsuits were moving forward. The bank was taking the house. And for the first time in his life, he had to face the truth. He had bet on the wrong son. It happened late one evening. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted but satisfied in a way I hadn't felt in years, working for a company that actually valued my skills, making real money, moving forward. No stress, no family drama, just a life I had built for myself, free from all the weight I had carried for so long. Then there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find my father standing there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair grayer than I remembered, his eyes heavy with something I never thought I'd see in him: defeat. "Can we talk?" he asked. I should have slammed the door in his face. I should have told him to go to hell, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped aside and let him in, watching as he looked around my place like he couldn't believe I had done this on my own, like he was seeing me for the first time. He sat down heavily on my couch, exhaling like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "The business is gone," he admitted. "Lawsuits, debt, the bank's taking the house next month." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Aim." He looked up at me, desperation creeping into his voice. "I need you to come back, Ryan. Help me fix this. If we work together, we can turn it around." I let out a sharp laugh. "Turn it around? There's nothing left to turn around. You let Dylan run it into the ground. You handed him everything and he burned it to ash." My father swallowed hard, nodding, like he knew I was right, but couldn't bring himself to fully admit it. Then he pulled out a folder and slid it across the table toward me. "I'm signing everything over to you, full ownership. You run the company, your way, no interference. It's yours." I stared at the papers, the same business I had once dreamed of inheriting, the same legacy I had worked my whole life to build, and I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no victory, no desire to pick up the pieces. "You think this fixes things?" I said quietly. "You think after everything you can just hand me the business and I'll forget what you did? You made your choice, Dad. You chose Dylan." His face crumpled, and for the first time in my life, my father looked like a man who realized he had truly lost. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have given it to you from the start. I see that now." I shook my head, pushing the folder back toward him. "Too late." He stared at me, pleading, but I was done. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for his approval, for his validation, for him to see my worth. I already knew it. I stood up and walked to the door, holding it open. "You should go," I said simply. My father hesitated, then slowly got to his feet. As he passed by, he stopped, turning to me one last time. "Where did I go wrong?" I looked him dead in the eye. The day you thought Dylan deserved more than me. Then I shut the door, and just like that, I was free. A month after my father showed up at my door, the business was officially dead. The lawsuits drained whatever scraps were left, the bank seized the assets, and the building that had once been our family's legacy was listed for sale. I didn't bother driving by to see it one last time. It wasn't mine anymore. It never had been. My mother called me one night, her voice soft, hesitant, like she knew I wouldn't want to hear what she was about to say. "We're leaving town," she told me. "Your father, he lost everything. We have no choice." I already knew what that meant. The house, the one my father had fought so hard to hold onto even when the business was crumbling around him, had finally slipped through his fingers. The bank had given them notice, and soon the only home I had ever known would belong to someone else. My father, the man who had spent his entire life pretending he was invincible, was now a broken shell of himself, reduced to taking handouts from relatives. "Where are you going?" I asked, though I already knew. "Ohio," my mother admitted. "Your aunt said we could stay with her until we figure things out." Not they. We. My mother was going with him. Of course she was. She had never known how to leave him, even now, when all he had left was bitterness and regret. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally I sighed. "You know you don't have to go with him, right?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Then a choked breath. "I know. But she would anyway." I swallowed down the familiar ache of disappointment. "You can come stay with me," I offered. "Just you. My door is always open." She didn't answer right away, and for a second I let myself believe she was actually considering it, that maybe, for once, she'd put herself first. But when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't leave him, Ryan." I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of my counter, nodding even though she couldn't see me. "Then that's your choice, Mom." Tears thickened her voice. "I love you, baby." "I know." The call ended, and just like that, my mother was gone too. I didn't go to see them off. I didn't watch as they packed up what little they had left and drove away toward whatever miserable life waited for them in Ohio. But I did hear about it. The old neighbors talked. The same people who had once smiled at my father, respected him, envied him, were now whispering behind his back how the once proud businessman had lost it all, how he had gambled on the wrong son and paid the price. And I just sat back and let it happen. No gloating, no revenge, no satisfaction, just the quiet realization that I had spent my whole life trying to earn the approval of a man who was never worth it in the first place. It had been weeks since I last thought about Madison, weeks since I let her name take up space in my mind. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a message that made my stomach tighten. "Ryan, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need help. The baby is yours. Dylan took all my money. I have nowhere to go." I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over, waiting for some kind of emotion to hit me. Anger, sadness, relief, something. But all I felt was exhaustion. She had spent months lying to my face, sneaking around behind my back, making me feel like I was the problem. And now, suddenly, she wanted my help? She expected me to swoop in and save her because her little fantasy life with Dylan had crashed and burned? I locked my phone, set it face down on the counter, and walked away. I poured myself a drink, sat down on my couch, and let the silence stretch out around me. I should have seen this coming. Dylan was a snake, a coward, a man who never took responsibility for anything in his life. Of course he ran. Of course he drained whatever money Madison had left and left her stranded, just like he had done to my father, just like he had done to every single person who had ever trusted him. The difference was, I had stopped trusting him a long time ago. She hadn't. And now, she was paying for it. My phone buzzed again. "Ryan, please. I don't know what to do. I know I messed up, but I don't have anyone else." I let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down my face. There was a time when that message would have wrecked me. A time when hearing her say she needed me would have made me jump in my truck and go to her without thinking twice. But that time was gone. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. I picked up my phone and typed out a response. "Talk to my lawyer. We do this legally. You are no longer a part of my life." Then I hit send, blocked her number, and let it all go. I put my phone down and leaned back on the couch, exhaling slowly. It was done. That was the last thread tying me to her, to all of it. No more desperate messages, no more guilt, no more second guessing. Madison had made her choice, and now she had to live with it, just like I had to live with mine. For the first time in months, I felt a strange kind of peace settle over me. Not happiness, not relief, just clarity. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold things together, trying to be the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who fixed everything. But some things weren't meant to be fixed. Some things needed to burn so you could walk away from the ashes. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and headed out. I wasn't going anywhere in particular, just driving, feeling the road under my tires, letting the city lights blur past me. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, about Dylan, about my father, about all the years I had spent chasing their approval, about Madison, the woman I had once imagined a future with, now nothing more than a lesson learned the hard way. I pulled up to a quiet diner, the kind of place I used to go to late at night after long shifts. The waitress smiled as she poured me a cup of coffee, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like just a regular guy. Not a man weighed down by betrayal, not a son carrying the expectations of a father who never saw him, not a fiancé whose world had crumbled overnight. Just me. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Madison, it wasn't my father, it wasn't anyone from my past. It was something new, something different. Her name was Claire. We had met a few weeks back at a networking event for electricians and contractors. Nothing serious, just a conversation that had felt easy in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. She had given me her number, told me to call her sometime. I hadn't planned on it. But now, sitting there in that diner, the weight of the past finally slipping from my shoulders, I found myself picking up my phone. "Hey Claire, you still up?" A few seconds later, a message popped up. "Yeah, what's up?" I smiled to myself, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know where I was going or what the future looked like, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was moving forward, and that was enough. 6 months passed, and in that time, I built something of my own. No father looking over my shoulder, no dead weight to carry, no one to steal my work and call it theirs. Just me, my skills, and a vision of what I had always known I was capable of. I started my own electrical company, a small operation at first, just a handful of trusted guys, but it grew fast. I took the clients my father had lost, the ones who respected real work, not just a family name. I modernized everything the way I had always wanted to. Digital invoicing, smart home integrations, high-end commercial contracts. My reputation spread, and before long I had more work than I could handle. The money was better than it had ever been, but more than that, it was mine. For the first time in my life, I wasn't working to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't chasing approval or trying to live up to someone else's expectations. I worked for myself, built for myself, and lived for myself, and it felt damn good. Claire was part of that new life too. It wasn't some whirlwind romance, no intense declarations of love, no rushing into something I wasn't ready for. It was easy, simple, no mind games, no lies, no baggage weighing us down. She knew about my past, but she didn't define me by it. She saw me for who I was now, not who I had been when everything fell apart. We took things slow, and for once, I wasn't worried about where it was going. I was just enjoying the ride. Then one day, my past showed up at my doorstep. I had just wrapped up a meeting with a client when my receptionist knocked on my office door, looking hesitant. "Ryan, there's someone here to see you." I glanced up from my desk. "Who?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Your father." I didn't react at first. I just sat there, letting the words sink in. I hadn't seen him since the day I turned down the business. I knew from mutual acquaintances that things had only gotten worse for him. He and my mother had moved in with my aunt in Ohio, but that hadn't lasted long. My aunt had gotten tired of supporting a grown man who had spent his life looking down on everyone else. Now he was back and he was here. I walked out into the lobby and there he was. He looked different, older, worn down, like life had finally caught up to him. His clothes weren't as sharp as they used to be, his posture wasn't as rigid. He wasn't the man who had once towered over me, demanding respect. He was just small. "I heard you started your own company," he said, his voice rough. I nodded. He cleared his throat. I need work. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could see it in his face. This wasn't easy for him. He had spent his whole life believing he was above everyone, believing he had all the answers. And now he was standing in my office, asking me for a job. I looked him in the eye, the man who had never believed in me, who had spent years making me feel like I wasn't good enough, who had handed everything I had built to someone who destroyed it. And then, without a word, I turned and walked away. I didn't owe him an answer. I didn't owe him anything. I walked back into my office, shutting the door behind me, leaving my father standing there. I didn't need to see his reaction. I didn't need to hear whatever excuse or apology he had prepared. It didn't matter anymore. There was a time when I would have done anything to earn his respect, when his approval would have meant everything to me. But now I saw the truth. His respect had never been worth chasing. His validation had never been something I needed. I had built my life without him, and I was better for it. And that brings me to you. If you had been in my shoes, if your brother had done what Dylan did, if your father had handed him everything you worked for, if your fiancé had betrayed you in the worst way possible, what would you have done? Would you have fought for what was yours? Would you have tried to take back the business, to force them to acknowledge what they had done? Would you have let your anger consume you, burned everything down just to watch them suffer? Or would you have done what I did, walked away and let them drown in the consequences of their own choices? The truth is, I never had to get revenge. I never had to lift a finger to make them pay. They did it all on their own. Dylan, the brother who always got everything handed to him, threw it all away and ran when things got tough. Madison, the woman who traded loyalty for greed, ended up alone and desperate. My father, the man who had spent his life picking the wrong son, ended up broken, powerless, and asking me for help. You don't have to destroy your enemies, just leave them behind and let them destroy themselves. Because when people build their lives on lies, on entitlement, on taking shortcuts, it always catches up to them in the end. You don't have to be the one to light the fire. They'll burn it down themselves. And while they're stuck in the ashes of what they ruined, you'll be somewhere else, somewhere better, living the life they never thought you'd have without them. That's the real victory. That's the real revenge. So tell me, what would you have done?